A notice appeared in the Unclassifieds of the Telegraph newspaper in Brisbane on the 20th of December 1898. Lodged by Alfred Hill, the worried father sought any news of his missing son, who had last been seen in the bush near Goodna, south of Brisbane, 10 days earlier. Alfred Stephen Hill was born on the 24th of May 1883, the eldest of 5 children. He had 3 sisters and a brother. His middle sister Mabel had died as a baby in 1887. Like his father, he was a saddler. The 16-year-old had set out on his skewbald pony to ride from Nunda, north of Brisbane, about 30 kilometres to Redbank Plains at 2:30 p.m. on the 10th of December, to visit one of his aunts who lived there. On the way, Alfred stopped off at Oxley to deliver a letter on behalf of George Crompton, one of his father's employees. Crompton's grandmother, Mrs. Catchpole, lived opposite the Oxley Hotel and was sitting near her front door sewing when Alfred rode up. She knew it was after 5 p.m, although how long after she wasn't sure, but certainly before 6 p.m. George had been intending to visit his grandmother and brand a foal that day, but was unable to get away. As they engaged in small talk, Alfred said he was going to Goodna and would return home Sunday or Monday. Alfred stood there a little while and then said, "Well, I'll be going, Mrs. Catchpole. Good evening." Mrs. Catchpole replied good evening, and the youth left. Alfred Hill visited Mrs. Catchpole on Tuesday the 13th of December, inquiring about his missing son, and was told of his brief visit. Mrs. Catchpole reflected later that Alfred seemed like a quiet, good young fellow. Following his visit to Mrs. Catchpole, there had been no further sightings of the boy. The days remorselessly passed until Christmas arrived, which must have been a bleak time in the Hill residence. Then the news came from Gatton, a country town west of Brisbane, that 3 members of one family had been murdered on Boxing Day, which soon became the greatest murder mystery in Queensland history. Michael Murphy, aged 29, had taken 2 of his sisters, Nora, 27, and Ellen, 18, to a dance. When they arrived, they found it had been cancelled and so drove home again. At about 9:30 p.m, at Moran's paddock, somebody had forced them into the bush, shot their horse in the head, shot Michael in the head, and later bashed his head for good measure. It was believed both women were raped and then bashed to death. Nora had been strangled as well. Semen stains on Michael's pants may have been his own when his nerves reflexed as he died, or there is a possibility he too was raped. That night a man with a short beard was seen by Mrs. Carroll and her son near the scene of the crime shortly before it was committed. The son thought the man was a recent arrival to the town, named Thomas Day. Day had a stubbly beard which he shaved off the day the bodies were discovered. Day was born Theo Farmer in 1874 and arrived in Gatton on the 14th or 15th of December. He met a local butcher named Clark and was hired, starting work on the 16th of December, remaining until the 10th of January 1899. He was described as having an unsociable nature. While the only topic of conversation for most people in Gatton for weeks after the murder of the Murphys, according to Clark, Day refused to speak about the matter at all. Police decided, however, that a swagman with criminal tendencies named Richard Burgess was the prime suspect. He had been released from jail on the 30th of November, and they focused efforts to locate him. Day was questioned, but Inspector Urquhart, in charge of the case, dismissed him as a suspect immediately. 1898 rolled over into 1899, and still no word about Alfred was received. The Telegraph, in which the ad had been placed, decided there was a story here, and interviewed the boy's father. The article appeared on the 4th of January. Frederick operated a saddlery business at Nunda, and related the journey that his son had made. He and his wife began to get uneasy on the night of Monday the 12th of December, when Alfred had not returned home, but told each other that he was just delayed, and would arrive Tuesday. With no sign of him, Frederick went to Redbank Plains, to learn the boy had failed to arrive. The next day, 13th of December, he went to Brisbane to report his son missing to the police. His attempt was fobbed off by the officer he tried to give the report to, who suggested a missing notice be inserted in the following week's Police Gazette. Frederick argued his son's life could be in danger, and that it was imperative to act quickly. Getting no help, he sought out a detective he knew personally, who started the official proceedings in motion. Checks were made at Brisbane General Hospital and Ipswich Hospital, but Alfred was not in either. As Goodna was the area where Alfred was last seen, Frederick tried to report the disappearance to Sergeant Small, the officer in charge of the Goodna station, who displayed the same attitude of incompetence. He ridiculed the idea that Alfred was lost, and pronounced that the boy had probably decided to ride off and start a new life. Thrice Frederick tried to get Small to take the case seriously, but in vain. And Mrs. Chatfield reported that she had seen a young man riding a skewbald pony on Stapleton Reserve at Goodna, prompting Frederick and a band of helpers to camp there and begin a systematic search of the area. As they did so, it was announced that a skewbald pony had been found at Rosewood. The party set off, but upon arrival it was discovered to be a different horse. The following day a new camp was established at Bundamba Water at the head of Daly's Lagoon. Searching took place over several days, following up reports, all of which proved to be false. Finally, on the 27th of December, Frederick met Sub-Inspector White, another policeman he knew. The uncooperative Sergeant Small began to provide help at last, under orders. Fred dismissed the notion that Alfred might have run away from home, saying that he was very fond of his home and was usually reluctant to leave it for too long. He had been given 4 shillings 6pence pocket money just before he left, and this money, along with his watch, was found under his pillow later. It was believed he only had half a crown with him when he departed. Instead, Fred believed his son had become lost in hilly country near Goodna. He admitted that he despaired of seeing his boy alive again. Police said everything was being done and expressed the belief that Alfred was staying away from his home of his own volition and had probably obtained employment somewhere. Such a rosy belief was dashed just the next day. On the 5th of January, a Danish man named Frank Hillman and his son were out gum-picking to use for tanning, when the son stumbled across the decomposing corpse of a skewbald pony, still with a saddle and bridle upon it. The horse was in thick scrub about a quarter of a mile off the Goodna Road, halfway between Oxley and Darra, in a location known as Burns and Walsh's Paddock. The father and son took the saddle and bridle off the dead animal and took them to Indooroopilly police station to report the matter. The following day, Frederick Hill was taken to view the carcass and identified it as the pony his son was riding. Ominously, the pony had been shot in the head from close range, indicated by a singed fur, right between the eyes. Nearby was located a campfire and what appeared to be a lump of burnt flesh. Tests were unable to tell if it was human or not. The pony's head was severed and taken by police as evidence. Another search party convened at 9 a.m. on the 7th of January, 1899. A soft spot in the ground was probed to check if it was a grave, but while this was being done, one of the searchers, Robert Bridges, had wandered about 170 yards away from the pony into a gully when he was assailed by a dreadful stench. Glancing at a pile of branches, he saw a pair of boots and a leg bone sticking out from under the foliage. Robert raised the alarm and the others raced to join him. Frederick and his brothers took in the sight and identified the boots as those of Alfred Hill. Police contained the crime scene and a doctor was called from Brisbane. A spare pair of trousers and Alfred's whip were found nearby. It was alleged that a piece of clothing burnt at the edges was found that day also, but in the excitement was forgotten about and lost. The body had largely decomposed in the summer heat down to a skeleton. Looking through the branches at the body, which was laying on its face, a hole could be seen in the skull, indicating that Alfred had been shot in the head. His father could identify his son by a missing tooth as well as his distinctive boots. At 3:30 p.m, Dr. Ray, the government medical officer, and a police photographer arrived. Before the scene was disturbed, 3 photographs of the body covered by branches were taken. One of the smaller leg bones was found 2 feet away from the rest of the body, where an animal had dragged it. The foliage was removed. The killer had placed green boughs over the body, and then overlaid 3 leafy saplings on top. Alfred's arms were doubled up under the chest, and the legs were wide apart. The speckled straw hat he had been wearing was under his right arm. The skeleton was dressed in the white shirt, coat and trousers Alfred had left home wearing. The body was loaded into a shell and taken away for further examination in Brisbane. It was discovered he had been shot with a .380 calibre bullet at close range in the base of the skull. the bullet exiting the forehead above the left eye. A small arm bone was missing, and the chest and abdominal cavities had completely dissolved, while around the pelvis and thighs the flesh had turned to a soapy consistency. In a pocket was found a small purse containing a watch key, as well a two-bladed pocket knife and 3 small nails. The body was swiftly released to the family and a funeral held which left the Hill residence at 4:30 p.m. on Sunday the 8th of January 1899. It was one of the largest funerals in Brisbane in many years, with 3 mourning coaches containing relatives, followed by 130 other vehicles and 40 horsemen. The cortege moved slowly on the journey to Lutwyche Cemetery. The choir of the Church of St. Mark's, Albion, of which Alfred had been a member, were in attendance at the graveside, and sang a hymn called "When Our Heads Are Bowed with Woe." Following the funeral service they again sang, this time, "Brief Life Here is Our Portion." On the same day Alfred's body was found, Richard Burgess was arrested for the Gatton Murders at the Bunya Mountains, near Dalby, but after questioning he was only charged with the theft of a saddle. Burgess could not be placed closer than 20 miles from Gatton. The initial report suggested that Alfred Hill had been raped prior to his death. Due to the severe decomposition of the body, this could not be reliably ascertained, but one reason was probably his legs found spread apart. The other reason why an outrage was considered was due to the police focusing on a suspect almost straight away, due to that man being seen at the Oxley Hotel just hours after Alfred was across the road at Mrs. Catchpole's home. That man was a former teacher at the Ipswich Grammar School named Edward Lytton Carus Wilson, who had led a colourful life in Australia since arriving from England. This individual had arrived in Adelaide, South Australia in 1887, allegedly from England, bearing the name the Reverend E. Carus Wilson, and dressing as a clergyman. He was accompanied by his wife, child, and a nurse. Wilson was 5'8" and walked with a halting gait. He was somewhat round-shouldered and had a low forehead with heavy eyebrows. While a clever scholar, he was not an agreeable companion, according to one man who knew him then. He bore testimonials from bishops and deans and asserted that he held a Master of Arts degree from Oxford. What his real name was, and if any of these credentials were real, is in retrospect debatable. He had money and spent freely. Later a woman claimed she had known him in the Terek district of northern Victoria in 1880. In March of 1890 he leased the Black Bull Hotel in Hindley Street, but was unsuccessful as a publican, and by 1891 was engaged in North Adelaide in scholastic duties. About this time Mrs. Wilson died, and the nurse returned to England. Wilson and his son relocated to Broken Hill, New South Wales in 1893. Somewhere along the way he remarried, supposedly in Victoria, and gained a daughter. At Broken Hill some people took a dislike to him and avoided him, while others concluded he was shy and reserved. He found employment teaching, and his pupils were fond of him, however. He introduced himself to the Anglican vicar and assisted with some mission work for a short time, before some scandal from his past was made known, and his help was no longer requested. It happened near the end of 1893, when during a visit by Canon Hindley from Melbourne, he was introduced to Wilson, who was familiar with places and people in Melbourne. Hindley inquired if he knew a Carus Wilson, whom the churchman added was a bad egg. Wilson mumbled a reply and departed soon after. Hindley realised and said to Reverend Wheeler, the vicar, "I've put my foot in it. That is Carus Wilson." Whatever Wheeler learnt, he shunned Wilson in future. After being rejected, Wilson in 1894 asked for £1 he claimed he was owed for cab fares while doing mission work. Wheeler had been going to pay the money, but another letter arrived threatening a letter would be written to the Barrier Minor newspaper, claiming Wheeler was not honouring his debts. The vicar was then resolved to pay Wilson nothing, and to have nothing at all to do with him. Mrs. Wilson left, and he put about the tragic story of her death and funeral in Adelaide. Sympathetic locals helped him with the cost of caring for his 2 children, until it was found that his wife was alive and well. He moved on again to Victoria in 1896. He and his family arrived in Numurkah in August of that year, so that Wilson could take up a position as tutor to the children of the Publican of the Globe Hotel. He bore recommendations from the Governor of South Australia and the Chief Justice, Sir Samuel Way. He worked as a lay preacher for the church at Numurkah and acquitted himself well. his contract expiring in December 1896. In July 1898, Wilson was residing in Warrnambool, Victoria, teaching at the college there, when he applied for and received the post of second master at Ipswich Boys' Grammar School. He said he and his wife had been unhappy, and she and their daughter now lived in Sydney. His crippled son, Claude, who was about 11, accompanied him. Wilson was judged to be about 45 years of age in 1898. A very taciturn man, he rarely got into conversations with adults, but his stern demeanour thawed in the company of boys. Wilson would buy them ginger beer, cakes and cigarettes. Soon he had arranged to provide evening classes at the house where he boarded, in a room at the top of the house where he would not be disturbed. His own son he claimed he did not have time to look after, and boarded him out with another family. Claude would get around in a small cart pulled by a goat. Wilson induced a boy of 14 to attend his private class. There seemed to be little teaching being done, the boy being given cake and taken into town for soft drinks. Wilson promised to take the lad into Brisbane to attend the theatre, but the boy's mother, sensing something was wrong, refused permission. Following the next visit, the boy declared that Wilson was a bad, wicked man, and that he would not go near him again, but refused to divulge anything more. About a month later, Wilson was leaving Ipswich, and the boy's uncle pressed the mother to find out what had occurred. Wilson resigned on the 9th of December, and left Ipswich on the 10th of December, the same day Alfred Hill was murdered at Oxley. On the 12th of December, the mother finally got the story out of her son. Wilson had made an improper suggestion, offering money and a silver watch if the boy would agree. The mother made a complaint, and police investigated. Their questioning on the 13th of December revealed that a dozen boys had been propositioned by Wilson to commit acts, some of which were said to have revolted one of the fathers so much that he had to leave the room hearing what the boys were saying. On the 14th of December, a warrant for Wilson's arrest was issued. Wilson and his son Claude were accompanied from Ipswich as far as Bundamba by Claude's mate Guy Betts, who guided the goat pulling the cart. At Bundamba, Guy bought some fruit and cakes, and then took the goat and returned to Ipswich. Wilson intended to catch a train, but met a farmer he knew, and he and his son were able to hitch a ride on the man's cart as far as Goodna. From there, Wilson pushed his son in the wheelbarrow-like cart to Oxley. Father and son stopped the night at the Oxley Hotel on the 10th of December. When asked by the landlady where they had come from, Wilson said, "Redbanks." His son corrected him, saying, "No, father, from Ipswich," and was told to hold his tongue. Wilson's behaviour seemed agitated and excited, so much so that he upset one of the serving girls. The police were certain that Wilson had raped and killed Alfred Hill, but they could not find the man with a crippled boy in a cart anywhere. Wilson had in fact left Brisbane on the 12th of December, boarding the steamer Rockton for Melbourne, where he and Claude transferred to the Yarrawonga on the 27th of December, bound for London via Albany, Western Australia, and Cape Town, South Africa. Stewards on the Rockton remembered the crippled boy. At Albany, police boarded the ship on the 9th of January and arrested Wilson on a charge of committing an unnatural offence on the 28th of October. Back at Oxley, amateur sleuths prowled the area seeking out clues. It was pointed out that it was civilians and not police who had found the body, and that had they relied on the police, Alfred might never have been discovered. One man filled 2 foolscap pages of theories at the site, which he shared with the detectives. Another confidently presented a small black button retrieved from the ground, where at least 2,000 people had milled about, lured by curiosity, as a vital clue. And on the 15th of January, a man's vest was located draped over a fence 300 yards from where the body had lain, repaired but still wearable. Returned to Queensland, Wilson arrived back on the 13th of February via steamer. Wilson was hissed and hooted at as he was moved from the ship to a cab. The next day, he and his son were taken by train to Ipswich, and there charged in court. He was said to have noticeably aged since he left the town, and appeared dejected. A magisterial inquiry was held on the 17th of February, at which Claude Wilson gave startling evidence. He said that he and his father encountered a boy riding a red and white pony. His father dragged the cart back and left the boy by the side of the road, and went into the bush after the lad on the horse. Soon after he heard a shot, and his father returned, and said he had shot a hawk, but it would be best not to mention to anyone the shooting of the bird. They stayed at the Oxley Hotel that night and arrived in Brisbane the next day, where his father told him he had sold the revolver he had used. Wilson denied they had met any boy on the road at Oxley, and said he had not owned a firearm since 13 years before. He had not walked into the bush, nor shot any hawk, he said. The only people they passed were a man on a dark horse, a family in a cart, and a swagman. Police attempts to locate the revolver said to have been sold by Wilson were fruitless. In addition to the Oxley matter, Wilson still had his actions in Ipswich to account for. He stood trial on the 18th of April for a sexual act on a 13-year-old boy. The jury found him not guilty of the act, but guilty of the attempt to commit the act. The judge sentenced him to 7 years penal servitude. Proceedings moved slowly, but also in April 1899, Wilson was charged with the murder of Alfred Stephen Hill and underwent pre-trial committal in the police court. During this, a letter was tendered in evidence, dated 6th of April, written from prison by Wilson. It was sent to Sophie Dahl, daughter of the station mistress at Darra, asking if she remembered speaking to him about train times at the railway station on the 10th of December, and them hearing gunshots at that time. Both the Dahls flatly denied they had ever seen Wilson that day or any other time before the court case. Wilson had asked another prisoner named Wakefield, who was being released, if he would go to the station and attempt through trickery to get Miss Dahl to sign a paper, whether she remembered Wilson or not, to use for his defence. The evidence was considered by the Crown prosecutor, but on the 19th of May found there was no true bill. In other words, the case wasn't strong enough to take to trial. Wilson was discharged on that matter, but still held under the sentence for the Ipswich offences. It was claimed that a relative of Wilson's was married to a prominent but unnamed Australian public figure, which is why the case was not proceeded with. Whatever the truth of that assertion, there was no evidence Wilson and Hill had ever met. No evidence Wilson had a gun that day. No evidence he had been where the body was found. Nothing but the story related by Claude, who had been in the care of the police for months by the time he related it in court, who doubtless asked the boy about the events of that day and suggested what may have happened many times over. Claude Wilson left Australia in January 1900 to go and live with his grandmother in Teddington, England. Wilson himself was released from prison on the 23rd of March 1904, after 5 years, and left for England immediately. Once in England, he was not long in getting into trouble again. In August, posing as a reverend, ordained in 1882, he defrauded stamp collectors. He wrote from various addresses to obtain some valuable stamps on approval without paying for them. He claimed it was all a mistake. In 1906, he tried to sell a manuscript written by Charlotte Bronte and sent to his grandfather, Reverend W. Carus Wilson, who was the inspiration for the character Brocklehurst in Jane Eyre. It was concluded the manuscript was a fake, and that Charlotte had not known his grandfather. It had been claimed by a letter writer in 1899 that Wilson had attended Cambridge, not Oxford, and that his family lived in Westmoreland, England, and that his grandfather was the clergyman whom Charlotte Bronte satirised in her novel. As with so much about this man, the truth is very difficult to fathom. After the failure of the prosecution of Wilson for the murder of Alfred Hill, no further progress was made in the case. Alfred's father died in 1933 and his mother in 1937. His last surviving sibling, his brother Sidney, passed away aged 80 in September 1971. In 1936 an article was published about the Queensland Police Museum. The cart which Wilson had used to transport his son was one of the displays, erroneously believed to have been used to move the body of Alfred Hill. Also kept as a relic was the skull of the hapless pony killed alongside the boy who rode him. The murder of Alfred Hill at Oxley and the Murphys at Gatton both went unsolved. Numerous suggestions have been made regarding the identity of the Gatton killer, including the local Catholic priest, a swagman named Joe Quinn, and a claim in 1901 that the killer was a lunatic who had been secretly sent to an asylum. The case is still avidly debated amongst true crime aficionados, whereas the Oxley crime has largely been relegated to a footnote to Gatton. Wilson was certainly a rogue and a pederast, but was he a murderer as well? It was certain he was not in Queensland at the time of the Gatton murders, and therefore could not be responsible for that atrocity. The parallels between the Oxley murder and the Gatton killings are crucial. In both cases, the horse present was shot in the head. There was no need other than a lust to kill to slay the animals, especially in the Gatton incident, where killing the horse would not have delayed the discovery of the bodies at all. Both Michael Murphy and Alfred Hill were shot behind the ear from close range. Hill was murdered before the Murphys, but his body discovered after the Murphys, so it could not be a case of a killer attempting to copy the methods of another. Even the calibre of the gun was the same, .380. There is a high degree of probability that the same person was responsible for both crimes. Thomas Day's whereabouts on the 10th of December are unknown, but he strolled into Gatton 40 miles from Oxley 4 or 5 days later, which does not preclude him from that crime. Constable Christie, who worked on the Gatton case, believed the swagman seen by Wilson was Thomas Day. He was certainly in Gatton on the night of the triple murder. The hut where he slept was just 900 feet away from the murder scene, and he may have been the man seen at the slip rail. The Queensland police were considered so inept at the turn of the 20th century that a royal commission looked into why they failed to detect so many perpetrators of heinous crimes. They seem to have focused exclusively on Burgess for the Gatton crime and Wilson for the Oxley murder, and dismissed Day altogether, Urquhart declaring him a beardless boy. The beardless boy was about 5'10", reasonably tall for the time, and weighed somewhere around 14 stone. He might have had a youthful appearance which misled the police, for he is estimated to be about 20 or 21, but was in fact 24 years old in December 1898. Those who knew him at Gatton remarked on his strength. Day lifted 2 of the sons of his employer onto his shoulders and walked around a paddock with them. The boys were aged 7 and 10 years old at the time. Day's workmate, Robert King, also commented that he noticed Day was much stronger than him when pulling a bullock into position for skinning. Clark reiterated this in his evidence. He is a very powerful man, and a big man too. If one person committed both crimes, they seem like the acts of a serial killer, but no further crimes appeared in the future. Thomas Day, under the alias Thomas Furner, died in Sydney Hospital on the 25th of October 1900 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Although the police knew, they kept the death quiet for another 18 years. While dying, Thomas claimed he had witnessed the deaths at Gatton and could not get the image of the heads of the victims being bashed out of his mind. Perhaps the abominable horror at Oxley also haunted him. He is the best suspect for both crimes, but the truth will remain forever out of reach in the dark corners of history.